Hello and welcome to Module 3. We are going to be trying to answer the question with the amazing help of Aidan Evans in the first part of his book, The Digital and Its Discontents, trying to answer the question, what does the digital do? And so we're coming off the heels of last week, looking at Heidegger's essay, the question concerning technology, which is, as you have probably already realized in reading through the first part of the book, that Evans' argument is very indebted to Heidegger's way of helping us think about technology, and particularly think about technology outside of its technological features, which probably sounded counterintuitive as you were coming into last week. Hopefully that's a little bit clearer to you what that means, coming out of and engaging with Heidegger's essay a bit. But one of the things that I think that Evans will provide for us is some clarity around the project of Martin Heidegger by applying it very concretely to the digital. And so where Heidegger has examples of different technologies and different kinds of thinking that is inframed within modern technological societies, I think that Evans does a really nice job of, in this book, of applying part of Heidegger's approach, because he's not only applying Heidegger's approach. There are other people that are motivating his thinking and that he's inspired by. But I think that the thing that Evans does really, really well is to get beyond a lot of the common questions that we would ask about the digital. So rather than dealing with what he calls the epistemological questions, and for those not familiar, epistemology is just a fancy philosophical way of saying how it is that we come to know what we know, or how it is that we can say we know things. And so if we were to approach the digital from an epistemological standpoint, we would get into a lot of the philosophical questions that you probably hear people talking about when they're talking about AI. So they, is AI, even though it's called artificial intelligence, is it an example of intelligent thought? Do these machines that are being trained on, so much data, how do these machines know the things that are in their databases, that are on the servers that it pulls from to provide us responses when we prompt large language models to generate output? Is that just a machine engaging in some algorithmic tasks in the way that computers that we understand computers to do normally, in the sense that when we would search for something on using Google, we didn't think that, even though it would say I'm Googling something or Google told me this, so even though we anthropomorphize technologies a lot, if someone was to ask, is Google your friend, you might say it in the metaphorical sense that I've been helped by having access to Google. We wouldn't talk about Google as personified or Google as being intelligent in the same way that now we're talking about and asking questions about, is AI intelligent like we are? Does AI do things in the same way that our brains do things? And so a lot of those boil down to epistemological questions. So how do we know what we know? How does a machine know what it knows? And so for Evans, he wants to ask a preceding question, which is the ontological question. And ontology is a fancy way of saying the study of being, or what exists. And so Evan's project in the book is an ontological project. And so in order to answer the question of this week, what does the digital do? We'd have to answer the question, about what the digital is. And so to answer the question about what the digital is, that requires doing ontology, which is why that's Evan's project. And so this approach will allow us to ask questions or answer questions like, where do computers fit in the history of human thought? For instance, is our thinking shaped by trying to behave like computers? Or have we been designing computers to try and behave like to try and think and process things like how we do? And from the introduction from Alexander Galloway, an interesting question that Galloway poses is, given how pervasive digital technologies already are in our world, it would seem to be that while we have all of these things because they're doing something that we can't do or that we need them to do. And so Galloway asks, what foundational lack is the digital machine so worried about filling? So when we find ourselves immersed in a digital society already, we're born and we start thinking about things, wow, these digital technologies are already all around us. Well, they must be all around us because they need to be there. They're doing something important. And so Evans thinks in order to speak to the specific tasks and the particular uses that digital technologies are being are having in the world, that we'll get caught up in the technological question, as Heidegger was worried about, in a way that already confuses, or maybe that's not the right way of putting it, in a way that where we're asking the question in the way that we're asking it because we are thinking digitally about the world. And so both Heidegger, even though Heidegger's question wasn't a question concerning digital technologies, but Evans is. And so before we can get at the applications of the technologies and to think about their uses in the world, in order to properly ascribe value and meaning to these technologies that already have value and meaning attached to them, in order to evaluate them on not their terms but our terms, in order to answer the question what it is that the digital does, we need to think about, well, what is the digital? And this will allow us to think about, the question of, well, do we have to go digital? Do we have to digitize everything? Is that something that's an inherent truth to the universe, to human society? Or are these choices based upon particular kinds of values, that certain kinds of valuing and meaning would push us towards digitizing everything, but that we needn't go in that direction? And so, because oftentimes if we look at, the work of, like, as we've looked at, like Nicholas Negroponte, where he's just, this is inevitable, that, the cat's out of the bag, and, we're in a digital world and we're never not going to be in a digital world. And so we often answer the question, why must we go digital, with, well, we answer simply by digitizing everything and then not having much explanation as to why. And usually we point to, well, it lets me do this thing, or it's more convenient than, but that doesn't answer the more fundamental question about the nature of what the digital is and what it does. Because Evan's worry about the digital is that the digital habituates us to different behaviors because it is a unique way of thinking about the world. And so beyond questions of convenience or particular uses that seem to be effective, Evans wants us to look at the way in which the digital has its own way of being in the world. And if we simply allow ourselves to habituate ourselves towards the digital, if we simply think, oh, well, the digital is here, so I need to behave digitally, whatever that might mean. Maybe Evans, I think, will help us think through what that means. If we don't think about, well, why should I be digital? Or is there any alternative to being digital? Then if we don't question that at all, then the digital seems like the most reasonable thing, because it seems very useful in many instances, it seems very convenient in many instances. But usefulness and convenience are particular value systems. And are there other ways that we might look at the digital to evaluate it on whether it should be useful in every instance, or whether it's only useful in specific instances? And so there's two big questions, research questions, that are organizing Evan's approach to understanding the digital. And so one, in thinking about doing ontology, or thinking about, well, what is the digital and what does it do? What Evans thinks you can reveal then, to use that word that we got from Heidegger last week, what Evans thinks we can reveal is what assumptions about the world are built into digital technologies. And then the second organizing research question that's motivating Evans' book is, what ideological and cultural values have encouraged us to fit digital technologies into every aspect of our lives? And so rather than taking it for granted, remember the idea of taking something for granted, or just assuming that things being the way that they are in the present is how they always have to be, or that because we live in a digital society, there is no other kind of society, or that we should continue to make our society more digital. So the second research question that's organizing Evans' book, I think, is really important. It's a key part of the first half of the book that we're reading this week. And so there's a couple distinctions, conceptual distinctions and concepts that Evans is working with that I'm going to talk about now, because they very much organize the first part of the book to get us to thinking about what it is that the digital does and what the digital is. And so rather than thinking about the digital as something imaginary and then or thinking about the digital just as a simulation, and the way that the digital is oftentimes seen as, like, there's the digital on the one hand and analog on the other. For anybody who's interested in the long-standing debate in music, in the world of music, between CDs versus vinyl, or digital files versus vinyl. What's at stake in those kinds of debates is something that's besides the point for Evans. And so the thing that Evans pits against, or puts as the opposite of the digital, is what he calls the actual. And so this isn't to say that the digital is imaginary or fake or made up, but that what the digital is a formal approximation of parts of the actual world. And what Evans means by the actual world is really oriented around chapter 3, which is looking at contingency. And so thinking about the ways in which our actual, what we would call our actual reality is grounded in what he calls a enmeshed world. And so for him, there's a level of indeterminacy to this. And that when we talk about the actual world, what we're referring to is the contingent reality so far as we can understand it. And that this is when he talks about it as a meshy reality, he's playing on the idea of it being a messy reality, as something that is past a point of our ability to comprehend it. It's something that becomes contingent and indeterminate, and this gets into, what we might refer to as the thing that's beyond all reasoning, that it's just chaotic, that there isn't any order to the world beyond what we can comprehend. And so he wants to oppose this idea of the actual to what a digital world is, which is a formalized approximation of parts of the actual world. And so the digital is something that comes out of the actual world, not as this is a fake version of the actual world, or this is an imagined version of the actual world, but it's an approximation of, it's an attempt to formally approximate parts of the actual world. And that those digital versions of the actual world have reality, they're real, but their reality, it has its own logic to it, has its own ontology. And so so you could think about that the ontology of the digital, or what the digital is something that emerges out of the larger actual world. But the tricky thing about the digital is because it is increasingly able to give a better and better approximation of the actual world, what we tend to do sometimes is to assume that the approximation of the world captures everything, including the contingencies of the actual world. And Evans thinks that this is just not true. And so when we compare the chapter on contingency and ontology in chapter 3 with the ontology of the digital that he does in chapter 4, I think you can see the distinctions that he's making there, which I'll talk a lot about in the next video. And the reason why he's wanting to maintain this distinction between the actual and the digital is because he wants to be able to answer the question of what have digital technologies wrought in the world? Like, what have they done? What do they do? So one of the big thing that we'll ask next week is, in the aftermath of being able to answer the question this week of what do digital technologies do, we will ask next week, what have they done to us? And so this is this question of what have digital technologies wrought upon the world? What is the consequence of them? This is one of the reasons why Evans is going through this long analysis of the digital, this ontological analysis of the digital. And this is something that he, as an aside, oftentimes when we think about, well, what are the consequences of certain technologies, we can fall really quickly into what's called technological determinism. We can fall really quickly into, oh, because we have digital technologies, these technologies drive our culture in particular ways, in this very linear kind of way, that as if technology is separate from culture in the world. And so I think he avoids falling into that trap because he doesn't think it's the case that the technologies drive our culture forward, because he has two parts to his approach in the book. And one of the second big part that I had mentioned earlier is that he's really interested in understanding what ideological and cultural values have encouraged us to develop and fit digital technologies more and more into every aspect of our lives. That there are ways of thinking about the world, and this is very much indebted to Heidegger's essay. There are ways of thinking about the world that predispose us to embracing particular kinds of technologies that will allow us to parcel up the world into the way that kind of thinking encourages us to. And so if we start with the way of thinking that, well, you work from the assumption, I believe that I could calculate everything about the universe, then you approach things in the universe as if they can be reduced to calculations. When we know there are things that even the most advanced theoretical physicists and theoretical mathematicians don't know how to calculate for. And even when they create consistent equations for understanding things, they're purely abstract and theoretical, that they don't have a corresponding experiment to back up their findings of what they found in their theoretical calculations. And so, well, you might ask, well, what are the ways of thinking about the world or what are the ideological and cultural values that have encouraged us to fit digital technologies, to develop digital technologies? And so Evans in this book points to three specific ones. One, I think we're already familiar of from Heidegger last week, which is this value and ideology of instrumentalism, of thinking about reducing everything to means and ends. This is really connected with the idea of causality and thinking about history as a linear set of events where there's a cause and an effect and a cause and effect and so on and so on. And this really, if we fall into explaining the world that way, then when we talk about technology, then we're going to be technological determinists. We're going to say, because we're in a digital age, we behave this way. And so it's a very causal relationship. Now, it's not to say that being in a digital age, we can't then talk about, well, what are the consequences of that, or what different what things do we do differently because we live in a digital age? But to not think about this as this overly simplified idea of cause and effect in a linear chain. And so that's, if you think of the metaphor of a mesh of interrelated things, there's multiple factors influencing any one event and happening, and that this is much more of a description of complex processes instead of actual single things. And so one of the values or ideologies that Evans thinks animates the digital is instrumentalism, this idea of means and ends, that everything can be reduced to a means and an end, in a cause and an effect. The other value that is really prominent for Evans is rationalism. And this can be thought of most simply as the ideology or the cultural value, or the cultural value or the ideological value that everything in the world is understandable by our minds, that we can ultimately come to understand everything, that our mind, given enough expansion or given enough assistance by technologies and science, can come to understand everything in the universe. And so the view of rationalism is just that it's an assumption that before I've analyzed or possibly tried to analyze everything, that I assume in advance that I can reasonably understand everything in the world. And the last value of the digital, or the one of the three, they're not necessarily privileged any more than the others are, is positivism. And positivism, what it sounds like is that this is this idea of things being positive, but positivism, if we look at the root of the word, is a posit, and so the idea that I posit something. I think it's most clearly exampled in what's called logical positivism, which is the idea that if I make a consistent set of statements that in their relationship to each other are logically consistent, and so you can look at this in formal logic, where if you have a particular set of statements that follow from each other, then the conclusion naturally will be true based upon those particular posited statements. And so a posit is just that I have put forward this statement about the world. It is either true or false. And then when I put a couple different statements about the world together into a larger argument, depending on whether the truth of those individual statements, my conclusion will either be true or false. And so this is the idea of positivism, the idea of positing particular statements about the world as being true or false. So why that's a value of the digital is that this relates really, really interestingly to the structure of the digital itself, which is the binary of ones and zeros, and the logic of how computation happens in digital technologies, which is a whole series of true-false statements, which triggers events to happen within the technologies to do this, don't do that, turn this on, turn this off. And so those three values, positivism, rationalism, and instrumentalism, for Evans are what come to define ideologically what the digital does. But interestingly, these are cultural values and ways of approaching the world, or systems of thinking that precede any digital technologies that we would understand as digital technologies. And that ultimately it is, to go back to his second research question that motivates the book, these are his answers to the question of what ideological and cultural values have encouraged us to fit digital technologies into every aspect of our lives.